Welcome. My name is Clarice Warner. I'm the girl with the pearls, the founder and education director of the Professional Reimbursement Network, LLC, where coding education is key. Thank you so much for joining our webcast. So I'm really excited to discuss with you some little nuggets that I gleaned from the 2018 ICD 10-CM coding guidelines. I hope you stay till the end, as I will share with you information on a free email course that will help you in your medical coding profession. Next is Chapter 9, Diseases of the Circulatory System, starting in section I00 through I99. And in the guidelines, there's on page 45. So number 10, pulmonary hypertension. Pulmonary hypertension is classified to category I27, other pulmonary heart diseases. For secondary pulmonary hypertension, which is in the code range I27.1 or I27.2, code also any associated conditions or adverse effects of drugs or toxins. The sequencing is based on the reason for the encounter. We also have guidance on acute myocardial infarctions, or AMI. The type 1 ST elevation myocardial infarction, or STEMI, and non-ST elevation myocardial infarction, or NSTEMI. The I-10 codes for type 1 acute myocardial infarction identify the site, such as anterior lateral wall or true posterior wall. Subcategories I21.0 through I21.2 and code I21.3 are used for type 1 ST elevation myocardial infarction, or STEMI. Code I21.4 non-ST elevation or an NSTEMI myocardial infarction is used for type 1 non-ST elevation myocardial infarction and non-transmural myocardial infarctions. If a type 1 NSTEMI involves to a STEMI, assign the STEMI code. If a type 1 STEMI converts to an NSTEMI due to thrombolytic therapy, it is still coded as a STEMI. Also, under the acute myocardial infarction unspecified, code I21.9, acute myocardial infarction unspecified, is the default for unspecified acute myocardial infarction or unspecified type. If only type 1 STEMI or transmural myocardial infarction without the site is documented, then assign 121.3 ST elevation STEMI myocardial infarction of an unspecified site. And then we have subsequent acute myocardial infarctions. A code from category I22, subsequent ST elevation STEMI or non-ST elevation NSTEMI myocardial infarction is to be used when a patient who has suffered a type 1 or unspecified acute myocardial infarction has a new acute myocardial infarction within the 4-week time frame of the initial acute myocardial infarction. A code from category I22 must be used in conjunction with the code from category I21. The sequencing of I22 and I21 codes depends on the circumstances of the encounter. Do not assign code I22 for subsequent myocardial infarctions other than type 1 or unspecified. For subsequent type 2 acute myocardial infarctions, assign only code I21.A1. For subsequent type 4 or type 5 acute myocardial infarctions, assign only code I21.A9. And then we have other types of myocardial infarction. The ICD-10-CM provides codes for different types of myocardial infarction. Type 1 myocardial infarctions are assigned to codes I21.0 through I21.4. Type 2 myocardial infarction and myocardial infarction due to demand ischemia or secondary to ischemic balance is assigned to code I21.A1, myocardial infarction type 2 with the code for the underlying cause. Do not assign I24.8, other forms of acute ischemic heart disease, for the demand ischemia. Sequencing of type 2 acute myocardial infarction or the underlying cause is dependent on the circumstance of admission. When a type 2 acute myocardial infarction code is described as NSTEMI or STEMI, only assign code I21.A1. Codes I21.01 through I21.4 should only be assigned for type 1 acute myocardial infarctions. Acute myocardial infarctions type 3, 4A, 4B, 4C, and 5 are assigned to code I21.A9, other myocardial infarction type. The code also and code first note should be followed related to complications and the coding for post-procedural myocardial infarctions during or following cardiac surgery. Next, we'll move to Chapter 12, which is the diseases of the skin and subcutaneous tissues in code range L00 through L99, and we will look at page 53 in the guidelines. And we're talking about non-pressure chronic ulcers. And all of this guidance is new. So this is very brand new guide. Well, first let me back up and talk a little bit where there was one additional note in this section about the patient admitted with pressure ulcers evolving into another stage during the admission. And they just added an inpatient hospital verbiage. So I'll read that. If a patient is admitted to an inpatient hospital with a pressure ulcer at one stage and it progresses to a higher stage, 2 separate codes should be assigned. One code for the site and stage of the ulcer on admission, and a second code for the same ulcer site and the highest stage reported during that stay. Okay, so for the new guidance in non-pressure chronic ulcers, patients admitted with non-pressure ulcers documented as healed, no code is assigned if the documentation states that the non-pressure ulcer is completely healed. Patients admitted with non-pressure ulcers documented as healing. Non-pressure ulcers described as healing should be assigned the appropriate non-pressure ulcer code based on the documentation in the medical record. If the documentation does not provide information about the severity of the healing non-pressure ulcer, assign the appropriate code for unspecified severity. If the documentation is unclear as to whether the patient has a current or new non-pressure ulcer, or if the patient is being treated for a healing non-pressure ulcer, query the provider. For ulcers that were present on admission but healed at the time of discharge, assign the code for the site and severity of the non-pressure ulcer at the time of admission. Patients admitted with a non-pressure ulcer that progresses to another severity level during the admission. This is number 3. If a patient is admitted to an inpatient hospital with a non-pressure ulcer at one severity level and it progresses to a higher severity level, 2 separate codes should be assigned. One code for the site and severity level of the ulcer on admission, and a second code for the same ulcer site and highest severity level reported during the stay. Next, Chapter 13, diseases of the musculoskeletal system and connective tissue. These are in the code range of M00 through M99, and we're going to look at coding of pathologic fractures, which starts on page 55 in the guidelines. They just added in that first paragraph on page 55, the 7th character D is to be used for encounters after the patient has completed active treatment for the fracture and is receiving routine care for the fracture during the healing or recovery phase. The other 7 digits listed under each subcategory in the tabular list are to be used for subsequent encounters for treatment of problems associated with the healing, such as malunions, non-unions, and sequela.
Are you interested in medical coding, but not sure where to start, and scared of wasting time and resources? Let me help you with the right steps to become a certified, marketable medical coder. Learn more at bit.ly/5stepscoder.